All right. Often like yoga is associated in India, especially with a spiritual practice, right? It is always considered like that. But more and more people are just focusing on the asana practice. And whenever we recommend asana to someone who's say mainly doing cardiovascular workouts or even doing gym workouts, it is considered as a flexibility practice. So we wanted to kind of really look at it closely and say what is it that yoga does or doesn't do. And then we started talking about that. We realized that we could actually extend it and understand what should be an exercise regimen to start with, and where is it that yoga actually supports, or what extra do you need if you only look at the physiological aspect of yoga. So to start from there, I thought, because it's such a vast topic, so if we take a scenario, say for example, a 30-year-old, someone who spends an hour exercising, or but doesn't have any preconditions, so is generally healthy, but wants to be healthy and wants to devote that time to exercising. What is it that that person should be doing so that they cover, all the needs of the body, which can be met through an exercise regimen? Yeah.
Yeah, and also just to understand, how do we even like measure fitness, right? When we say we want to be fit, what are some of those, let's say health markers or things that you can track? It's not about how many miles or steps you walked, or it's not about only how, what percentage of maximum heart rate you got, what zone you got into. But overall, if we were just to talk about having a healthy and fit body, what does that mean from a scientific perspective?
Yeah. So usually in the context of exercise and exercise prescription, most of the evidence at this point in time points towards the fact that it has to be of a certain intensity and there has to be a certain dose. So just like we talk about medicine, right? If you have an infection, the doctor often recommends antibiotics, and you have to take them twice a day for 10 days or 7 days until that infection goes away. And at that point, your body will recover, you'll start to feel good and healthy. So it's pretty much kind of trying to get at a similar prescription for exercise. And I'm talking exercise or physical activity holistically. So it could be yoga, it could be dancing, it could be aerobics, it could be swimming, cycling, walking. But there is a prescription now based on the whole body of evidence. I think the earliest studies date back to the 1950s. They were very rudimentary. We didn't have fitness trackers at that time. We didn't have health trackers at that time, but there is a whole body of literature since the 50s supporting many health benefits of exercise and studying different forms of exercise and what they can do for health and wellness. So the current prescription stands at 150 minutes of moderate intensity aerobic exercise. So there are pieces to this puzzle. So 150 minutes, which means in totality per week, you need to amount to 150 minutes of movement. It has to be aerobic in nature. So it has to be something that exercises your cardiovascular system, your heart, your lungs, something that gets your heart rate going. And it has to be of that moderate intensity. So that kind of gets a little bit tricky if you don't have a fitness tracker, if you don't have a way to quantify what is light exercise, what is moderate exercise, what is vigorous exercise. There are these classifications about intensity of activity that are often reported in the science. So moderate intensity is where your body is exercising between 3 to 5 METs in terms of exertion. So one MET is a metabolic equivalent. So one MET is the amount of energy your body is using and expending at rest. So you both are just sitting at this time, your body is not exerting, but internally your body is working. Your stomach is churning, your heart is pumping, your lungs are working. So your body still needs energy to function. And that at rest energy is referred to as 1 met. That's your baseline level. So 3 to 5 times more energy is what is considered as moderate intensity exercise or moderate exertion. So 3 times as much exertion from the time you're sitting or at rest. So that is the clause at this point in time, or a recommendation at this point in time for intensity and duration of exercise for maximal health and wellness benefits. Um, there is some evidence pointing to whether there can also be, if you can compromise. So in a way that instead of 150, can I do 75 minutes, but can I up my intensity? So can I go for 75 minutes of vigorous exercise? Can I just go all out and sprint for 75 minutes every week? Or do something that's extremely high intensity exercise for 75 minutes? And there is some evidence which suggests that those two types of things will get you similar results. Physiologically, they are different in the moment, right? Sprinting is very different from walking physiologically. But in totality, if you were to amass all the science, all the evidence, in just aggregate all the health science and studies, it suggests that 150 minutes of aerobic or 75 minutes of vigorous is going to get you some good, solid health benefits. There is also another recommendation, and that is that the body needs 2 or more days of strength training or muscle-based exercise. And this is where yoga or other forms of exercises which are not aerobic in nature, which are not aerobic by default, come into play. So earlier when Shruti, you mentioned that there are different kinds of fitness, right? So cardiovascular fitness is just one piece of the puzzle. There is body fat and body composition, which is a big part and important. So it's your ratio of water to fat to muscle in the body. It's so important for all types of metabolic disorders, obesity, diabetes, many, many others. So there are different components to fitness. And the second recommendation about doing 2 or more days of strength training or muscle-based activities is also recommended based on the evidence, based on the science. And these muscle-based activities can be, again, any type, as long as you are using your different muscle groups. You can use weights, you can use resistance bands, you can do yoga, you can do Tai Chi. So there are different ways in which you can exercise all your muscles without necessarily getting your heart rate high, without necessarily making that activity aerobic in nature. So these are the two primary prescriptions at this point in time in the science. And all this evidence is across different countries, across all kinds of studies, across different populations. The recommendations are a little different for young children. So the recommendations are age-based. So the ones that I shared with you are for adults and for older adults. For children who are under 18, they are a little bit different. They are actually higher, as you would expect. For children, you would expect that they actually double. They need an hour a day of playtime or movement time. So the prescriptions for children are higher as compared to those for adults or older adults.
Okay, thank you so much. That was really helpful. Just a couple of quick clarifications there. One is when you said 2 days of muscle training, how much time? Is it still like an hour a day, less, or I mean, how much time?
Yeah, so for the muscle strengthening activity, they don't quantify it by time, but the clause is that you have to exercise all major muscle groups.
Twice a week.
Mm-hmm. Twice a week. So you can't just be doing push-ups twice a week. You can't just be doing squats twice a week. You have to use everything from the neck, chest, back, abs, lower body. So all major muscle groups of the body have to be exercised twice a week, preferably on non-consecutive days. So taking a rest day in between those is recommended.
Right. And I do have a follow-up question there, but before I go there, I think you covered the aerobic part quite well. just a quick clarification there. When we say moderate intensity, let's say for a layperson, that would mean brisk walking or jogging or maybe cycling or something like that. Is that?
Yeah, something that will get your heart rate to go a little bit faster. There is often a reference used in our literature, like if you don't have any technology, if you don't wear a smartwatch, you don't wear a Fitbit, you cannot track your heart rate. How do you know that you are doing moderate intensity exercise? And we refer to it as the talk test. So if you are able to have a conversation as you're walking or exercising, that's light exercise. If you are able to have a conversation, but you have to stop to catch your breath, that is moderate intensity. And if you just cannot hold a conversation and you have to pause more and more frequently, then that will be really vigorous intensity exercise. So there is that talk and sing test, as they often call it. So that helps you gauge whether you are really getting to that point of exertion. And each of these can be at different, the same activity as regular exercise.
Absolutely.
That person may be able to bike for 10 kilometers pretty easily and be able to talk to you as they're biking along. But if you have a 30-year-old who is not very high fit, is obese, has some chronic conditions, for that same person, biking 10 kilometers could be a tall order, and that could end up being vigorous exercise as opposed to light or moderate exercise. So it is very subjective based on the health status of that individual, chronic conditions, obesity-related markers, general genetic and health history overall that can determine what intensity of activity the person engages in.
That makes sense. Priyanka, do you have?
I think the aerobic part, like you said, I mean, I understand a lot better from how I understood it before. I think the muscle strengthening part is where I think yoga comes in a big way. So I understand that yoga may be good for cardio if you can do a moderate flow based yoga for 30 minutes, and it becomes like a cardio exercise, and then you're kind of moving all the time. Is that right? Is that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are definitely certain styles of yoga which can become high intensity. If you go to a very vinyasa style practice where the instructor is just moving you along different sequences at a very fast pace, then that could easily get your heart rate to go higher. So it becomes at that point almost like a combination of strength and aerobic forms combined into one session, because not only is your heart rate high, but you're also continually using your body to do different movements, to balance yourself, to hold yourself in different positions. So it can definitely be a combination. And that's where a lot of the newer exercise trends have come in. So there is something called CrossFit. I don't know if you've heard of that, but it's essentially alternating between aerobic versus strength. And you're trying to do one workout which has a combination of both. And so I think there are certainly styles of yoga that would fit into that kind of a mold where even though historically we often think of yoga as being something that is more a gentle, calming, relaxation, mindfulness, meditation, breathing focused activity, there are certainly styles of yoga which could make it a very quick, high intensity aerobic form of activity.
Yeah, well, that's really helpful. And just by understanding this, I feel like I want to include that in my routine. So some of the days I would just focus on that, because my practice leans towards more of like a hatha style, like you're saying. And also when we think about historically, the life was such that you were always on the move when you were working. So maybe cardiovascular wasn't the priority that time. And I think now it's completely different, like we're just sitting in one place. So it's really good to understand. But I want to get deeper to the muscle strengthening part also, because whenever we start talking about it, there are so many different ways of doing that. Like strength training with weights is so common, and then you have yoga. And if you go a little deeper, like there's so many new forms, like Pilates is a new form. So just to understand what are they trying to do at a muscular level, and what could be a goal, what could be the goal for strength training. Also in yoga, sequencing is very, is highlighted a lot, that you have to sequence your muscle training so that the lower body muscles support as you build up the strength. So is there any scientific research on that?
So the science really hasn't evolved to that stage yet. I mean, we don't even know if one form of yoga is better than another form of yoga. So it's still at a very early stage of evidence. Most of the scientific work that is done, at least largely, that is good quality, published in peer-reviewed journals across the world, most of that science seems to focus on traditional hatha yoga practice. So it's more like a slow flow yoga class. So you are moving through different sequences, but it's not high paced. It is also trying to focus on alignment. So you want to make sure your foot, your arms are angled the way they need to be, that you are in the pose, taking a few deep breaths before you move out of the pose. So they are, most of the scientific studies and publications that you will see are related to that slow flow hatha yoga style of practice. But certainly the practice itself does target various components of fitness. So like earlier we talked about aerobic fitness, cardiorespiratory fitness. So that's one piece of the puzzle. That's undoubtedly the strongest predictor of longevity and strongest predictor of health. So there is a lot of evidence to support that a good cardiovascular system, a good cardiorespiratory system is associated with a longer lifespan, a better quality life, a healthier life, fewer chronic illnesses and diseases. So that is a given. We know that from the evidence. But there are these other components, like you mentioned, there is muscular fitness, there is morphologic fitness, there is metabolic fitness, there is flexibility and agility. So some of these components become important, especially for certain populations. Like, for example, a lot of my work focuses on middle-aged and older adults. So for them, that flexibility, agility, balance components are really important, because that really determines whether they can live independently, they can function independently, whether they need to go into an assisted living facility or they can continue to live independently in their own homes, doing their everyday chores. So there is definitely aspects to fitness which become important at different stages in life for different individuals. And so any type of exercise prescription really needs to be customized to the needs of that person, to the health of that person at that given time or that given phase of life. But in terms of evidence regarding those specific components, again, we are not at a stage with yoga research where we can definitively say X hours of yoga, X style of yoga done these many days of the week or for these many months is going to guarantee you these types of results. We don't have that strong of an evidence base at this point in time to make those prescriptions. So it'll probably take a few decades by the time we have that strong evidence to support those claims or make more definitive prescriptions within the context of yoga practice. But the components like muscular strength and endurance is really important too. So muscular strength is essentially referring to how strong your muscle is. So we often measure that in the context of one repetition max capacity of the muscle. So for example, if I'm trying to measure my bicep, I would start by lifting 20 pounds. And I can test whether I'm able to lift 20 pounds. If I am, I'll up it up to 25. I'll try to lift 25. I'll up it up to 30, 35. So it's one repetition at one point in time. What is the maximum load that my muscle can take? That is referred to as muscular strength, right? That is different from endurance. Endurance refers to, if I were to lift 10 pounds, how long can I keep going? Right? How long can my muscle keep moving or repeating the same movement until it gets fatigued, until it gets exhausted? And so there are those two separate components to fitness or muscular fitness, where strength and endurance both become important. And again, we don't have evidence yet. We don't know whether there are certain styles of yoga, certain movements or asanas within yoga that would build one or the other, or that could be helpful to build one or the other. We still haven't gotten to those nitty-gritty stages yet. There is morphological components, so bone density, height and weight, body mass, visceral fat, so fat around your ab areas, which is again a predictor of morbidity or chronic disease in general. There is also metabolic components such as glucose tolerance, for example, oxidation. So we know in the context of stress in general, we know that that does have an impact on your metabolics. We know cortisol, for example, is strongly associated with poor performance of the body, right? High levels of stress or high levels of cortisol will impair your functioning at many different levels. And so we know there is some connection between yoga and mindfulness and breathing and relaxation and stress reduction. So all those things are connected, but we haven't teased out the evidence, or we haven't teased out the science to be able to make definitive prescriptions as to which components are more or less affected by the practice of yoga specifically.
But just that was again very helpful. Thanks, Neha. But just going back to the muscle training component, right? As you say that if, 2 days a week you would like to exercise all your major muscle groups in the body. So I think overall, if we see that a well sequenced yoga practice would give you that. So would you say that then yoga can basically take care of your muscle training component if you do it well for all the muscle groups?
Yeah. I mean, as per the guidelines, so the guidelines that I've been referring to are published by the CDC, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention in the US. And it's the federal agency for health and wellness. And they actually list yoga as an option to complete that requirement of 2 or more days of muscle strengthening. So they recognize that yoga, especially in the West, is more commonly used as a muscle strengthening activity, more so than a vinyasa, high intensity, high flow activity. So
Sure.
they do recognize that a majority of the yoga studios, if you were to survey yoga studios in the US, most of them will say that they engage in slow flow hatha yoga style asanas or practice. So it's not a purely aerobic activity. It's more focused on muscle strengthening, muscle alignment, body alignment. And they recognize that as a form of, or one of those prescriptions that would meet your muscle strengthening guidelines. So you don't have to hit the gym and you lift weights. You could very well be at home, use an app or a video or any other kind of virtual session of yoga and meet that requirement of your muscle strengthening by performing a yoga practice twice a week.
That's really good to know.
That's good to hear.
Yeah, because in India, as we see, even in urban areas, the access to gyms with all the weight machines is not very common. I mean, we grew up without access to gyms. Let's be clear about that. And it's so nice that even our parents' generation, who have been doing yoga regularly, are able to reap those benefits for their age at now. So that's wonderful to hear. I think I just wanted to also ask a related question, which is, we talked about the benefits of yoga for muscle training, and we talked about certain aspects, certain styles of yoga that can bring in a cardio element. There's also 21 or 108 sets of Surya Namaskars. That's becoming pretty common. But would you say, are there some fitness goals where yoga complements some of the other popular exercises, some the aspects that yoga might bring in, which are not provided by let's say your jogging and swimming or weight training with kettlebells?
Yeah. I mean, I know you hear, at least anecdotally, there are athletes in the West who will choose to do some yoga on the side, and they are pro football players or they are pro soccer players. And they are practicing this on the side because a lot of them report it as helping them mentally or helping them with the mental aspect of the sport or the competition or for stress management or for just kind of mental well-being in general. And so there could be various reasons why somebody chooses to complement their training or regime with a mix of yoga to it. But physiologically speaking, yes, there could be benefits. Again, it depends on what type of a athlete it is, what type of their training usually is structured as. So if it is somebody who does track and field and they heavily focus on aerobic and cardiovascular training, lower body strengthening, then it's possible that maybe yoga could be a good way for their muscles and their body to recover. Maybe doing a slow flow sequence might help as a cool down for their stretches. We even see that with some gymnasts. It might help them again with more flexibility, mobility in movement, because for gymnasts, that is the key to their success in terms of their performance on the mat. So there are certainly certain sports where you can see the direct relationship between how movements and practices in yoga could possibly complement their training regimes. But again, a lot of these athletes have, like if you are a professional athlete, you have a very structured routine. So you probably do a lot of training, you do a lot of body work to build your strength, to build your endurance. So you also don't want to overdo it. And so it's trying to find that balance between what helps, what doesn't help, what is their usual training like, and what kind of training would possibly supplement their existing work or their existing training. But certainly practice of yoga can help athletes in not just in terms of their physical movement and performance, but also on that mental aspect side of things.
Yeah, on the same note, I wanted to ask, so is there evidence of yoga helping the, say, endocrine system, like the hormonal system, or exercise in general helping? And what do you need in your exercise to balance the systems, other systems of your body, to influence other systems of your body?
So again, most of the evidence is based on aerobic activities because that has been the longest body of literature, that has been the most popular form of activity that has been extensively studied. In fact, walking is the most commonly studied form of activity because we learn to walk from a very young age, and it is a free activity. You don't need equipment. You know inherently how to do it. And so all you have to do is just put on those shoes and get out for a walk. And so you will see a lot of the evidence is based on the science or the movement and the motion of walking, and how just walking is good for your body, is good for your health, is good for your fitness, a variety of the fitness outcomes that I was mentioning earlier. There are definitely anecdotal studies specifically with yoga, where there have been studies which have shown that yoga could help menopausal women with changes in their endocrine and hormonal systems, or yoga could help veterans, especially here in the US, where we have a large number of veterans with lower back pain, which is a common complaint with individuals. So there are some of these anecdotal studies. Some of those are pretty sizable studies. So you can say they have enrolled and tested maybe 100 or more participants with certain health conditions. They have done randomized trials. So they have one group that does yoga, and then they have another group that is given some placebo in some sense. And they are trying to compare whether the yoga group does as good as the placebo or it does better than the placebo. So there have been some studies, but again, like I said, the evidence, I would say the science of yoga and the studies have just picked up in the last 2 decades. So early 2000s is when we have started to see an uptick in yoga research in general across the board. And so it will be some time before we get some more definitive answers to what populations could benefit the most, or what physiological changes can you expect. But there is definitely some evidence for stress reduction, particularly in the context of cortisol. We have done some studies in my lab as well, looking at how salivary cortisol, just taking a saliva swab and checking for cortisol as your stress hormone, how that can be attenuated after a yoga practice. So we know that people who do practice that immediately after the practice, you might see a lower cortisol response, or a calming effect is what is often labeled to. So there are some studies physiologically which support that anecdotal experience of people sharing that, oh, I feel so relaxed after a session, or I feel so calm after a session. So there certainly seems to be some physiological backing to that in terms of some studies. But again, they are not consistent studies done with the same rigor, with the same strict methodology. So it'll be a while before we have more high quality studies with larger populations, larger data sets that can validate those findings.
Well, so this shows your work is so critical in the field. So thank you for doing that.
Ah.
And